everybody. Um, it was an exciting time I found to listen to Kevin, and not just because of his deer stories. Those of you that were on there know how successful he was with that. But from his background and understanding of our area, um, I'm going to dwell on hay and pasture rejuvenation principles. I brought haying in because when Megan and I talked about this with rejuvenation, I think it all fits pretty well. I think there's a couple of things that need to be addressed that are an opportunity for us. And then we're going to try to answer some of these questions for you. The reality is that Alberta's hay yields have not been stellar. When you start thinking that 1.3 tons per acre, it has been a trend for many years to hover in that 1.1 to 1.3 tons per acre. And if you think about that, you think it's about 2 round bales an acre, maybe not, depending on your weights. But all said and done, can we have higher yields where everybody knows that a new hay stand, of course, has higher than that, and you're hoping for getting that 2 or 3 ton yield? When we look at forage production from pasture, of course, what we're looking at is that the work that had done with Agri-Profit's cow-calf producer surveys through the province, and that, in fact, was Alberta producers that were cow-calf putting their pasture data forwards. And when they did that from the years of 2004 to 2015, when we looked at the numbers that were coming from it, we were seeing about 30 animal days per acre. And so to me, that was pretty disappointing, because in animal days, that was reflecting a 1,000-pound animal. And I'm thinking to myself, goodness, can we not go higher? And the other thing that I found rather interesting was some work done back in 2006, when in fact a number of the team from Lara and others were looking at putting together the rear round grazing publication, 365 days. And one of the things that came out of it was the perennial pasture yields were actually so low that when we looked at them, we found that though the expenses of seeding an annual for swath grazing were present, swath grazing, in fact, per unit was cheaper. And that was a warning sign many of us took from that project. And at the debriefing meetings afterwards, one of the things that was focused on was, and that was back to days, long time ago, when the thought was with Megan Elston now, that we would have to be looking at our perennial pastures more critically. And so one of the mentors I've used through the years is a gentleman by the name of Ed Rayburn, and I believe it's Dr. Ed Rayburn, out of West Virginia. And he's always written some neat things. And some of the things he writes are very applicable. And as he says, the reality is a profitable livestock business needs to be low cost. One of the best ways to do that is based on that pasture, and that pasture to build off of. And the reason why that is so important is because when you look further, you find that one of the biggest things is the higher the stocking rate you have per acre, the higher the profit per acre. And we're not talking just grazing fresh air and sunshine, as the joke goes. We're talking about feeding them well. So we need to have the productivity for those stocking rates to be higher in order to be more competitive per acre. And how can we do it? And so some of the projects that have come, you've seen along your way with looking at greater amounts of legumes and sod seeding and other things, improvements have all been back to that in pasture rejuvenation, of course. And the thing about it is planning. And another mentor to me, and as Megan and I were talking a little sooner, a lot of us have mentors, and I find that some of these people that are pretty a long time experience, Dr. Mike Schellenberg of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at Swift Current, a plant ecologist, and I love the ecology thing. He said, you got to do some planning. And the thought about that is setting yourself up for success beforehand and thoughtfully approaching it from options and viewing them. And now, of course, we've got some of the advantages through some of these programs that Kelly and Megan are leading the charge on through the RDAR program, Results Driven Agriculture Research, On-Farm Climate Action Fund, and also through the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association. So when to improve pasture and hay, and a gentleman who actually was based out of St. Paul, Jerry Ellard, and Jerry himself is a gentleman for many years that was there and working with the public lands. He said, look at some critical areas. What is the yields? What is the production from desirables and undesirables? And then let's come up with some suggestions for management. And of course, what happened is you fell into the categories where you were seeing a lot of 50%. Then 50% of yield, literally. Production from desirable species faltering and coming down into the 50%. And species and weeds. Then looking at where the rejuvenation of pastures in this subject tonight and hay stands comes in. Because Jerry did this for pasture and hay. And with hay, it could be fertilizing, with mowing or herbicide use, rest periods for pastures, and adding new species to stands. But when we get to poorer yet, that is driving home another point. Do we go even further? And I'll take that a step further in a moment, because another one of the people, RV Oder out of Laklabish, who'd worked in your area for so long and was a mentor to many of us, it was his thought at times is to pull the plug and restart. And when do you do that? And we'll talk about that in a bit. But it's the poor and fair productivity. It's when your ratings are starting to show that more than anything, you're below the half mark in a lot of things. And in the bad things, you're climbing to the half mark. I'm looking at hay first. And this is something that Dr. Kevin Sedovic talked about last week too. And for me, when I look at hay, I look at the legumes for nitrogen. And I say to myself, I want a fair bit of legume in any stand that I can. And then many times people say, well, I've got more of an acid pH soil. I don't know if I can grow alfalfa. Well, AC Meadowview alfalfa, I think we mentioned in our last our very first session, is an acid tolerant alfalfa. But beyond that, now with the wonders of round bale silage and everything, there are opportunities for clovers and other things to be legumes for nitrogen optimization. And maybe it doesn't work so well for hay, but for silage it does. Now, feeding the legume needs. So the idea there is the nitrogen's expensive. Let's use the legume for that. Let's feed the legume to feed the grass. And as we're doing that, we're trying to base it on needs. And as we're looking at needs, one interesting thing that came out of last week in Rejuvenation that Kevin shared, Dr. Kevin Sedovic said, why don't you graze one time a hay stand every 2 or 3 years? And he wasn't talking about just clean off what's left there. But he was talking about using a hay stand a little more as a pasture at times, step in there, graze it first, maybe after it's got adequate growth in the spring, and let the regrowth come for late fall grazing or for haying, depending on how you manage it. But you're recycling nutrients with the animal. And as the animal recycles so much of what comes in one end goes back to the other. It's addressing a void and making maybe phosphorus very much more available, potassium for the plants, and helping the legumes do so well. And yeah, sorry, I didn't get Kevin in there until there, but that was from our last week, and that was an interesting one. One of the other tables that comes up, and that is just saying that when we're taking off hay, we're taking off nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. And nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, I realize I'm moving my mouse on the wrong screen, so my apologies. When we've got an alfalfa stand with 18% protein, it is equivalent to about 58 pounds of nitrogen per ton of dry matter harvested. So expect the legume to give you that, but where does it get the phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur? So maybe that is something. And I don't say to people, oh my goodness, you have to put 60 pounds on. What I say to people is look at that ratio, and maybe you put 10% sulfur, maybe you put 6 times that in potassium, and maybe 1/4 of the phosphorus, but you're looking at a ratio of affordability from one year to the next, or the possibility of just managing that stand to keep it more productive longer, so that when it's down there, it's paying the bills for you to leave it in hay. This was something Harvey Yoder had come up with. He said, do a soil test. And if you don't have adequate balanced fertility, do something about it. And the idea there with phosphorus, this is available phosphorus. And if we've got plants working well for us, there will be some unavailable phosphorus coming in the system. But it doesn't mean you don't look to add or keep that balance in line, because we know that, as we just looked at, 14 pounds of phosphorus, PTO5, that's fertilizer. It's not just phosphorus. It's 1152 fertilizer. So 14 pounds of it is in fact disappearing per ton. So this is only 2 tons equivalent. So as we're looking at these numbers, these are some baseline numbers Harvey felt were important. Nitrogen, a residual amount, is present at a low level no matter what you do almost. It can be very low. If it's too high, I find that in a solonetzic soil when the productivity is pretty poor, or if I've got some real deficiencies, then I might find my nitrogen levels are coming up because I'm not able to produce to use it. But that's some baseline numbers Harvey felt you needed. And another gentleman that did a lot of work with Alberta agriculture back in the 1990s and 2000s, Jerome Lequez. Jerome said, what if we didn't put any phosphorus on a hay stand? What if we put phosphorus on a hay stand? And I believe this was 50 pounds of phosphorus. So it was equivalent to, when I said 50 I meant 50 of fertilizer. So it would be like 100 pounds of 1152. So he put on about 50 pounds of P. That would be around something in the range roughly of 100 pounds of 1152 or something. And look at the difference. Look at how the legume's performing so well. The grasses also, because of feeding off that legume. So there's some real opportunities of rejuvenation by fertilizer. Though fertilizer is expensive, trucking and fuel and size of bales, as I quickly find out, weights vary differently and everything. So if I'm running my baler around my field, my hay bine around my field, my hay rake around my field, they better be big swaths that I'm taking off myself. I put this in here because another fertility expert, all it showed that I wanted to show is it doesn't take much to make a difference. And years later, when you had 25 pounds, that's 3 years later, of phosphorus, that's like putting 50 pounds of 1151 on. So it's not a lot, but in fact, we'd kept that amount in that stand about 5% more. If we went up to 50 pounds every year, lo and behold, we'd kept that amount in the stand about 15% more legume. And all of that doesn't reflect the yield of the total forage there. This was a mixed forage study. So the point of that is that it fed the grasses to feed the yield too. So we just got a percent of legume in the mix, but yield of the whole production system went up. And then times people will say, well, it's just a grass. It doesn't have a legume in it. And we know on the gray wooded soils how important sulfur is. And nitrogen plus sulfur really hit the bill. So when we put no fertilizer, nitrogen only, or nitrogen plus sulfur. So the point of all of this is a blend of fertilizer on perennial mixed stands will in fact support a biodiverse, longer term, higher production hay stand that's more resilient in drought and in moist conditions as well. One of the things that Dr. Dan Undersander had brought to our attention is he said, and we all know this, the highest yields are in the second and coming into the third year of seeding. Why? Well, there's extra water from the annual crop that fell in the fall that got banked. There's fertility that addressed needs. But also the fact is that our productivity drops over time. So if it does drop over time, how long do we leave a hay stand down? And that I would hazard to say is we leave it down too long. And taking advantage of it by looking at the fertility it can give the following crop. And you can pull out this is of course all recorded. Megan's got it recorded. If you want to pull out your iPhone and take a picture of it, go right ahead. But the idea behind that is that you've got fertility credits that you could take advantage of by taking hay stands out of production. And I know people will often say, well, it's a challenge getting them reestablished. We'll come next week and we'll talk about that, because in this series, that's the last session. And to me, there's some real inroads to forage establishment that are unfortunately being missed, and some things that I think are pretty crucial to look at. But you've got fertility to in fact work maybe even with a neighbor, pull it out of production for a year or two into a grain crop, but alternate. And if you go back to what Dr. Sedovic said about grazing, maybe your hay stands become grazing and hay stands, not grazing stands after they've been depleted and are unproductive as a hay stand. That's one of the rejuvenation downfalls we often accept so easily is, well, let's just graze it this year because it's not producing very much for hay. Well, now we're beating a dead horse, and I'd rather have a thoroughbred or quarter horse instead of a dead horse. Another thing about rejuvenation to me that's important is let the numbers tell the story. And it's so often that if we keep a little bit of records, you will find that, you'll see yourself saying, well, last year was dry and the year before that wasn't the best, but the year before that was better. And then all of a sudden you find yourself thinking, well, this is a trend. The productivity has been going down no matter what. And if grazing days are dropping, then the idea of rejuvenation is being driven home by numbers and trends and numbers. And this Alberta Tame Pasture score sheet card, it's still available on the internet. And it's really doing a what's there and why. And in putting it together, Kathy Erichuk, Erickson Erichuk and myself worked on it. Kathy really did most of the work, by the way. I don't want to take credit for little bits I did, but I am on there. We tried to make something more simple, just like Jerry Eller did, and said to ourselves, okay, folks, what is there as an indicator? what is there for a ranking. And if you get low in too many of the score columns, maybe it's time to do something about it. So again, it's an opportunity for an evaluation, and that evaluation tells the story. And again, it's just asking good questions. Kathy wanted that to be there. And the idea is make it simple. Let's answer some questions. And at that time, we wanted more legumes present. And so that's why we had a bias where we wanted to have 30% or more yield from legumes, because even then we knew that. So you can see this. It's available on the internet. Just punch in Alberta Tame Pasture Scorecard, up it comes, and it's available and you can use it in multiple ease of doing by printing it off or such. The one thing we're always looking for is a cause and effect. And in holistic management or wrenching for profit, you'll hear people say, what's the root cause of the problem versus the symptom? Because we don't want to treat symptoms knowing that it's not going to deal with the problem. And asking yourself why 5 times was something that was said, and trying to answer it a little more in depth often leads you down a path of discovery. It's kind of surprising how that works. And then what? What now is the problem? And as you're answering that, it starts pointing in a direction of how best to address it. When is always important, because if it's into a drought, maybe this isn't the time to do something. If it's cattle prices, and one thing we knew from way back in Australia, and a person I work with, Graham Finn, would often say, when times are good, we took the money and used it to, so we didn't pay taxes, but we banked it by building resources, redoing landscapes so they were more productive, and other things, building things that are going to rejuvenate, be more productive. So timing so important. And then the how. As we get down to the bottom line, what are the options to address a problem? And the answer is always it depends, and it depends based on your cash flow, the type of the land it is, and somebody will say it's so rocky you can't do anything with it. It's so steep you can't do anything with it. When I was over in New Zealand, I watched them come down a hill one way and then drive around and come back down the hill the one way because it was so steep. And then they had a water roller that was really immense with big circumference so that it had a lot of pressure to push the rocks in the ground. Well, so when one says we can't, somebody else maybe says you can. And what can the future hold? What can the differences be? Can they be significant? And this is one of my failures. All of us make mistakes, and that's my poor daughter helping me out. But I knew I shouldn't have kept that cow one more year. She had a bad udder, but she always had good calves. So just one more year. And you can guess, I should have cut my losses one speck sooner. And the old saying my mom used to say, your first loss is your best loss. So I guess like anything, we need to look at the situation and decide what we can do and why and what's affordable. And we'll try to do some things here. And in the seeding section as well, address more of the sod seeding and how some of the tricks of the trade to get around it. A friend of mine, Sarah Sommerfeld out of Saskatchewan, who is a forage specialist, and right now I think she might be an environmental program specialist, made a decision tree. And she's just like Jerry Ellard. It's kind of the same thing. Evaluate the existing and see where you're going and which path it leads you down. Oh, I can manage it. I can manipulate it. I can enhance it. Oh, I guess I just need to replace it. Oh, maybe I just need to break it all up and replace it. Oh, you know what? I think I can seed into that I've got a system for sod seeding that might work. Again, a decision tree. And in many cases, rejuvenation is rest and deferment fits well. And we'll talk about that. And harvest timing, that certainly can be giving a different advantage, and harvest being grazing or haying. I was looking at a situation up your way actually, and the gentleman went out each fall, cut it only once, but he cut it right to the ground and took everything. And if you were here last week, you know what happens with that. And we'll talk a little bit about that coming up. We have to manage perennials with a perennial mindset of next year as well. Anyway, so again, a decision tree to help us with our options. This is just another way of looking at it that I'm going to giving you the options, and we're going to walk through them a little bit. As we look at them, there is something that is pretty important I'm going to drive home with this. And now is an opportunity for some of those things where we can hopefully take advantage of some of these government programs and do some things that allow for changing of a grazing system. We can look at a big opportunity in bale grazing. Bale grazing was one that it's a huge amount of nutrients coming onto a landscape. And so with it comes a dramatic change to productivity and an opportunity from a broad multi-fertility program: phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, boron, everything under the sun. But it is a massive influx of fertility to try to put a jump start into a system. And the majority of people will know that bale grazing is one system. You can't cover enough land, but I know all the good work you guys have done up on bale grazing with Alyssa and Megan Elston in the past, looking at waste and everything. There's certainly some good work that's come out of Lakeland on bale grazing. And the other one being herbicide and stock use management for weeds. And the idea of that is something not new to anybody. Where do we put our money? Do we put it into herbicides, or do we actually manipulate animals? And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm not such a big fan of this. The aerator system, the deep ripping might have a benefit in hard packed soil, but the timing, and you need to look at something else in my mind. We generally found that aeration was not an answer that worked for most people because it didn't address the root cause of the problem. So often those stands were very shallow rooted, and people will say they're sod bound. They generally were evolving species to less ideal grazing species, or in fact, they had more similar compaction layers under them. And then getting more serious, we can break and reseed. So as we look at the more seriousness of it, we could also look at sod seeding as other angles come, and looking at it from a manner of thoughtfulness. And I'll deal more with the sod seeding next week, because seeding of perennials I felt would be better fit there. The seeding into timing, the species, the method, again, a little more of that next week, seeding perennials. But I do think there are options too, whereas Dr. Sedovic talked about haying or grazing, and doing so maybe even with maturity of some of these stands, because we'll often get a Sicer milkfetch, bird's foot trefoil, Alsike clover that sets seed quite readily. Sandfoin doesn't do so well up your way, but it does set seed pretty readily. And so even this year, I found I had some yellow blossomed alfalfa that had some seed set. So depending on the years, it's an opportunity to put up less good quality feed maybe, but I've seeded quite a bit of my land to orchard grass by bale grazing, more mature orchard grass. as a hay stuff. And so where the stand was smooth brome, and over the course of time, the orchard grass that came in, I was expecting quack grass to kind of take over, but no, away came the orchard grass. One of the shockers kind of from last week's agenda, if you were there,
Grant, we can't hear you. We still can't hear you, Grant.
Megan, can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you now.
I don't know why this is doing that. My apologies, everybody. Okay, hopefully I won't get any dogs barking. All right, I'm gonna hop back. Then when Kevin said they don't go dormant, it was a really profound statement because we say they go dormant, but we actually don't really mean it. We will say that grasses go into a fairly depressed state of using nutrients very slowly to, in fact, bank what they've had from the previous year to be their store pile for the winter. Grasses in the crowns of the plant, above ground more than the roots, as people think, but it is above ground actually in the crowns more. Legumes often in the roots, and starches or fructans are two of the sugar types that are used to keep them functioning and respiring and living throughout the winter. So they're not dormant. No, they're really not. And many years ago, okay, I'm just presuming things are working here.
Everything's good.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Dr. Llewellyn Mansky loudly told me at a conference I was wrong, and that whenever you graze a plant, you affect it. And I can't help but think Megan and I were discussing tonight that he comes from Dickinson. And of course, Dr. Sedovic and crew are just down the road from him at Fargo, I think he said. But the point of all of that is when you graze a plant, you affect it. That's important for rejuvenation. It is important to remember, because one of the things that you're going to have to deal with is in your own mind saying, okay, I don't have a safe spot, but how can I work with it? The other thing that Dr. Ed Rayburn said that scared the life out of me was he said that before renovation, a pasture's in balance. Well, if it's that bad, why is it in balance? Well, it's in balance with our management, our fertility. That means we need to do something different. And that's the point of rejuvenation. If you're not prepared to do something different, it's not going to change. you're going to be back to where you started from fairly quick. And the point of all that he was making was that finding the root cause of the problem, addressing it, is important, because if we don't address the problem, what we've in fact got is a repeat. And you hate to be making the same mistake over again when you could in fact be avoiding it. So that reverting back, and my daughter found this and sent it to me, and I can't even read the author, but it's so unfortunate, but it is something that's quite true in life. It seems like, you know, we're got to learn our lessons. That's all there's to it. And it doesn't go away until we do. One of the biggest changes I think that was made by Dr. Mansky to consider was, and we've heard it said, 1 day in the spring, it loses us 3 days in the fall. And that was actually coined by Dr. Hugo Gross of Brandon. And everybody uses that terminology, 1 day in the spring, 3 in the fall. Well, the gentleman who said it was Dr. Hugo Gross. And it wasn't doctor, my apologies, Hugo Gross, a scientist though at Brandon with Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada. And that was one of my little discoveries years ago with Dwayne McCartney, trying to search out who actually said it originally. And that's where we came to. So remember, what you're doing is setting the stage. One of the worst things we can do is open the gates and graze the pastures into the ground. We are grazing the lifeblood right out of that pasture. And as we're doing it, we're setting the stage for next year and what's going to happen. The positive thing, if there is one in that, is that they are resilient. You have to hit them twice or 3 times or 4 times before they really do move to that lower level. And that's why when people ask me what to do, I often said, feed. Try to feed your way through in the fall. Let those grasses have some leaf growth, and we'll talk about that. That leaf growth in the fall, what people will say is, well, my stand's slow to come this spring. Well, you know what? Maybe they're saying the root cause is I didn't leave enough leaves per tiller in the fall. I know that I'm grazing cows right now, and Megan and I shared a picture with her. And as those cows are grazing it, depending on how severe they're grazing under the snow and through the snow, how many leaves I'm leaving on, and actually it's quite a few because I did dig around some more and I have pictures of it. But the point is, or part leaves, by the time you've got 3 part leaves, I consider that, you know, at least 1.5. But that won't be a pasture I'm going to come to first next spring. But I do expect that I am impacting it by the fall grazing. And it could be driving frost in the ground, changing snow as an infrastructure of insulation, but it's also the crowns and the sugars and the regreening of leaves that so often occurs. And even with it being so dry and brown, when I dug the snow back today to look at what was under there, there were green leaves on the meadow brome. And I thought to myself, you know, under this snow, it got rehydrated. And because it's easy to push an electric fence post in the ground, it's not frozen. So in the fall, 2.5 leaves per tiller, and you're back to normal. So all I'm saying about this, and I'll address it in a minute, it doesn't mean you don't do things. It just means you have to remember you did it so that you don't repeat doing it, and you know what to expect because of it. And so my productivity on that pasture might be negatively affected next year somewhat because I got high production yield in the fall off of it instead of feeding as much as I could have. So in the spring, the key, let the plant tell you it's ready. A tame plant is a 3-leaf stage. Then it waves its flag, I'm ready to be grazed. And it's grazed, growing, captured the carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis through those first 3 leaves of growth, to now have restored its nutrients that it's used in respiring for the winter when it wasn't dormant, or the drought in the fall when it was still living actually. So you're looking in spring for a 3.5 leaf stage on a native stand before the plants say they're ready for grazing. And wherever I start, I won't be starting there on that same pasture next year. I'll try to start on a different one. So it's equal and opposite measure, and I'll drive that home in the point. In that if we start one place, we're always looking to balance off. Try to leave pasture residual 2.5 leaves intact in the fall on as many pastures as you can, or the ones you want to go to in spring that you know you're going to calve on or other things. So with that, in fact, we're going along. So I've got about 10 minutes left, Megan, I think.
Yep, about 10 minutes.
Okay. Again, one of the things, this is more for the rhizomatous grasses, the haying grasses, defer and fertilize. That's something that is a bit of a challenge to me, because I know that they elevate their growing points in late May. And if I graze them in late May even, I am removing those growing points. So I really want to let a mass grow up into June until I get a lot of that higher yield in front of me to graze. You have to treat it more like a hay stand. Quack grass is a little bit in between, I've found on it, so I can get away with it a little. But you're looking at a mixed stand, and what's the majority of the mix? Here is equal and opposite measure. When you end up here sometimes, try to leave it here sometimes. When you end up there sometimes, go here sometimes. Because if I do this, I know I've got some plants that are this, some plants that are that, but if the average is here or the average is there, I'm setting a precedent. As Dr. Sedovic said, a sweet spot. Where do the animals want to come back to when I bring them back for the second graze on that same paddock? Here. Not here, not there. They want to be here. So I need to, in terms of getting higher production per acre, I use a 2-time over system. And the 2-time over system we'll talk about in a minute. We are doing a balance. The water is so crucial. The leaf area, as you shared, is so crucial. Litter for keeping the soil cool, reflecting soil, heat, water infiltration. Very important, because we know now, we say to people that, how much rain did you get? And then we say, how much rain did you capture? Because we know that a lot of rain, in fact, doesn't infiltrate. It sits on the surface, it evaporates, it doesn't have the root channels to get down deeper. And that's why we're looking at changing our pastures to be more biodiverse, with deeper tap-rooted species of legumes in them, to create highways down into the soil that are paved, and the fibrous roots that are going to be a cushion near the surface and litter on the surface, and regrowth and production for next year based on managing for a perennial nature of a stand. I am really trying to, that came and went too fast. But in springtime, after that recovery, then I graze with about 1/4 to 1/3 with the first grazing. This is for rejuvenation and for maintaining a high productivity perennial pasture in the areas of the province where we can get regrowth that's decent and suitable. The second time over, I take more. And so my thought on that is, one year it's going to be this pasture, another year it'll be this pasture, one year it'll be spring, one year it'll be summer, one year it'll be late fall. But that's a management thinking system for vigor in the plants, to get the earlier growth in spring for rejuvenation, rejuvenation of shoots and roots. The plant rest is crucial for that, but more the Dr. Sedovic talked about with bunch grasses like meadowbrome, orchard grass, and things like tall fescue and crested wheatgrass, is those plants will perform better with vigor, root and shoot, earlier spring growth, and give you a longer growing season, and just simply be more productive when we manage them with that type of rotation I just talked about. The thing about a lot of this I want to emphasize is it's not just fertilizer. Yes, manure and urine are crucial to go back on it. But one of the people that I used as a mentor for years, in fact, she's the reason for the Sustainable Grazing Mentor Program getting started, was me bugging Ula on the way to work in the morning asking for advice. The point of it is that rest and rotation, fences can do wonders. We're not just talking about mismanaging, we're talking about well-managed with rest being part of that. The fact is rotational grazing, even of a poor pasture, as we call bluegrass so often, is in fact going to give us higher productivity. But if we do a little additional fertilizer in these sites in Manitoba, you can see where when we have a year where nitrogen's a suitable price, where we can in fact choose to do something about it, using some fertility. And I'd even look at a blend when I was doing that. I'd look at a soil test first. And when I looked at it in cost back in February this year, it was about 4 cents per pound of forage. I paid 9 cents per pound of forage this fall for hay. That's what I bought my hay for. It was over 9 cents a pound. So if I'd have spent it on 4 cents a pound grazing forage, I'd have been money ahead. Adding legume to grass pastures, that's something we'll talk about with seeding more next week, but we know that we can get, just as the same was back true of the hay stand, the legume to feed the grasses, and yields that are optimizing. And when we look at the yields we can get with a 40 to 60% legume stand, it can be equivalent to up to 100 pounds of N being added. They feed quite a bit of nitrogen, but they also hydraulic lift water. There's other things they do that give us many benefits that we know. And I'm going to pass over this one. The reality of bale grazing or using animal stock density to do things, to trim our aspens, to beat up our thistles, doing our timing right, the bale grazing and what it contributes. What I was going to say about this, the tensile nature in spring is so much less, so much easier for animals to damage aspen particularly versus even poplar. But in spring grazing, getting them out there at high enough stock density to really damage the aspen and push it back. And with the thistles, training the animals. And that's something I think I've got a speck of, and it might just be the last thing I show. The bale grazing benefits, and this is our place, we're looking at what amounted to being on June 3rd, it was bale grazed, and this is a green feed. So it was a poor quality green feed that was bale grazed in about 97, I think it was. That was in July. So you can see the amount of production that came about in 30 days, from June 3rd to July 23rd. And I might have some math wrong there. But the point of it is it can really feed a system well for productivity and really boost your yield. And so bale grazing is a great rejuvenation thing. The thistle encroachment after bale grazing, what I wanted to say with it is one of the areas where we do look at weed control and do things. But one thing I know is that with aspen or thistles, the mortality that happens in early spring is in fact huge compared to the mortality that happens in July. So get out there with your animals as a controller. Yes, chemical can be used, but Kathy Voth, and she manages the On Pasture website, but she was the person to put together Livestock for Landscapes. You can find the whole recipe of teaching animals to eat thistles and other weeds, and it does work. I could tell you how not to do it, but I know how to do it too. So I need to spend some time doing it right. But we can get animals to be our own weed controller. I'll pass by the aerator. Suffice to say that legumes give us a benefit. And when we look at more grazing days from legumes, we look at Alberta cow-calf producers' data. And when we did over a 6-year period that Dale Khalil had analyzed, cow-calf producers that put their numbers forward for the AgriProfits benchmark cow-calf survey, he asked them pasture questions and asked them about if they had more legume in pastures and got their productivity. And then in 2013 to 15, when we were carrying out what we called the Sandfoin project, we went out and furthermore biased the sample and got people that had even higher legume amounts to contribute their data as cow-calf producers. And by soliciting them and getting them into the system, we found that yes, actually, when you get a larger pool, there is maybe more opportunity for profit. What I wanted to say about direct seeding, and I'm going to spend some time on this next week, because I think I can fit it in better because my time's kind of coming up. But I think there's some real things to look at for consistency. And I think for a higher success rate, Harvey Yoder was the one that said, well, what if you just put it in the annuals for a couple of years before reseeding it back? And there's no doubt that the method, and I'll share this next week with you, but when we use glyphosate and herbicide removal versus cultivation and everything, what we're actually doing is if we said, you know what, we're going to do a little cowboy math. So Lauren and I sat and did this many years ago, and then I went back and touched it up. But we said, what if we know that in 1996, our swath grazing was $1 a day savings over traditional feeding systems. Today, is it that? Is it more? Is it less? I'd hazard to say it's more than $1 a day savings. So what if I sprayed out that pasture and I, of course, then grazed it. So really I grazed it and had my cake and eat it too. I went back the following year with glyphosate, seeded annuals into it. I didn't get as good a swath grazing yield because it was a field that was sprayed with glyphosate, and the nitrogen mineralization was going to be slower in breaking down. So I swath grazed it. I got about 100 days of swath grazing, and 100 days times $1 gave me $100 in my pocket. Year 2, I went back and I had a higher productivity because I had less competition. I had a little more moisture banking, and now I had $250 in savings. And when I look at the cost, I had something in the range of $80 in cost, $250 in savings. So maybe I had $170 to invest in Harvey Yoder's new reseeding. Or maybe I just choose to let the cattle do a little reseeding for me. So this is my last slide. And, you know, it's really the end of us thinking about it for now. But what it is it's making those good questions so that you can address the root of the problem and do something about it so that it doesn't come back to haunt you. The old hay stands need to be taken out. You don't want to make them into low productivity pastures. They need to be converted, and if anything, put them back into a higher legume grass pasture. And we'll talk about that next week, about seeding and how to get more success with that, more resilience and stability with success. But trying to take advantage of some of these government programs to put some money in your pockets to do some things that are going to make a difference for you and make a difference for productivity per acre on the land. And as Dr. Rayburn said back then, we were looking at that low cost, and the lowest cost comes from a good productivity that is management traded into instead of straight costs added into. So for many of us, that's where we look at the higher legume grass pastures. And there's a couple of great videos that are out on the internet that we've worked on establishing and managing. And that's something for next week to even talk about. Megan, I'll pass it back to you if there's any questions or anything.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Grant. If anybody has any questions, you can pop them in either the question answer or in the chat.
Scared everybody away. This whole series, I think, does pull together a lot of tools to set you up for success and to look at your present situation. And I know all of you have a lot of great experience out there, just trying to get some of those points to ponder. And be it from, a grass isn't dormant, it remembers. But it's an ecosystem with stability. And so resilience, you can't expect to take it down overnight or build it up overnight. And that's one of the challenges why we don't want to do things detrimental, because if we get 1 year upon 2 years to 3 years, then it's starting to change our ecosystem and give it a stability at a lower level now of productivity. And with a loss of species that so often happens that we didn't even know when the Kentucky bluegrass came in, why there's spaces in between plants, why the dandelions are so bad, all those sorts of things that give us an answer back in saying something's going on here. But what happened? It might have happened 3 or 4 years ago. And it might be that's the point to watch out for, so that we can see things unfolding more quickly. And that's why I like the equal and opposite measure. There's never a mistake. It's simply learning. And that's where we're looking at, in fact, changing. And if we think we did something wrong, I try to do the opposite next time of right. And it's just a mentality of balancing that gives a lot of respect to the ecosystem and respect to the plants out there. And in a year like this, the cows are, yes, I'm supplementing because they were going through 10, 12 inches of snow to get what I had for regrowth of legumes, which was pretty good, actually, legume grass. But you can't ask them to do that with calves outside and everything too. But it is still, my hay bill is going to be $2.70 a cow day with hay and straw. So the minute I turn to that, and that's not considering much yardage. So all said and done, I think I can supplement. I'm supplementing probably $1.60 a day. But I'm thinking that that's $1 a day grazing I've got versus $1.60 or something.
We do have a couple questions. So Leona asks, with saline soils, can you expect rejuvenation to take longer?
You need to approach saline soils with a bit of a recipe. And the idea has been that you need to address the root problem, and that is usually we've got a water problem that's bringing salts to the surface. We need to usually approach it with trying to intercept water as much as possible prior to that saline area and in that area. So we look at doubling the area, trying to plant remedial species that have some salt tolerance around in the outer area into the inner area. And in a matter of about 5 years, my brother at Willingdon turned around a piece that was a burnout. He had alfalfa and smooth brome on the uplands. He had salt tolerant forages like slender wheatgrass, tall wheatgrass, Russian wild rye, and Elsite clover for flooding in the saline area. And he went back in there. He picked his time till they got a little bit of rain and moisture, and then he sprayed it out and sod seeded, I think with a 750 drill, John Deere drill, right back into it, the smooth brome and alfalfa, and it caught. So I looked at the line and I couldn't tell where, we called it the cucumber piece. I couldn't tell where the cucumber piece was. So 5 years is what he did with it. I can't say it'll be that fast for all of us, but the interceptor, because they're usually a water discharge area where the soil is so hard that water's coming to the surface and evaporating to the surface and bringing salts to the surface. So we need to spread the salts down through the surface, deeper into the soil, so that it isn't critical at 1 inch or 2 inches where you plant a seed so shallow, it's toxic. So is it going to take longer? It depends how well we learn our lessons, Leona.
Perfect. Thank you, Grant. We have another question from Evan asking, will bale grazing over thistle help with getting rid of it?
Bale graze, it's Evan, you said?
Yes.
Okay. What happens with it at times is, the answer is it depends. I have had thistle everywhere, and then the smooth brome came back with a vengeance. And it was up to my shoulders 3 years after, but about 2 years after, the thistles was to my shoulders. The other piece that I showed in the picture is mine, and it's still there. And I've tried a number of things, and I need to try something different. Bale grazing on top of it might help it, because what you're doing is you're adding a massive amount of fertility, but what species of grasses were in there? The thistles initially are going to be the deepest tap roots. They're going to come back with a vengeance right away. My hope is that he's got some other species there, because I didn't have smooth brome in that piece. It had meadow brome and timothy, and both of them didn't respond to the bale grazing like a smooth brome or Kentucky bluegrass would. And so my thought on it, for Evan's sake, is I think it will work. And some of those fields that had, thistle to my shoulder, it's very little thistle now, and they're pretty productive pastures. But then I've got that problem area. So tell me what I've done wrong there. I maybe think I know a bit, but give it a try, and train your cows to eat thistles. They will. So use Kathy Vo's recipe she's got for doing it, but you need some young helpers to go clip thistles for you to use as part of the training episode. And replacement heifers, if you're thinking of not keeping replacements, it doesn't work. You're trying to put animals into a herd that are going to be Einsteins, the smart ones that are going to perpetuate training of their calves and others. So you are looking at those impressionable teenage cattle. And so you are looking at those replacement heifers more than ever as being the ideal species to use for training. So Megan, do we have any more, or is that it for now?
Yep, we have another question. So if clover started to take over a hayfield, is there still any hope for rejuvenation, or does it have to be seeded new?
So clover taking over a hayfield, and I think what's part of that is concerns of L-site clover, maybe for horses or other things, issues accordingly. The clover coming in is probably a shortage of nitrogen. And as there was a window of opportunity, the clover stepped into it. And now we've got in many parts of the area, L-site clover is a seed bank in the soil that's in the gray wooded areas and other areas. And when you get a clover year, away it comes. And I'll find that even true. If it's clover, it's going to be birchwood trefoil as well. Because of seed banks that they have. And it's a spring where the grasses don't get off to such a good start and a shortage of nitrogen in the system. So one of the things you could do is, I know that PK&S help the legumes, but I would say do a soil test. And with that soil test, 0 to 6, 6 to 12, I do know that you can shift from Kentucky, and this is work done in northern Saskatchewan by Dwayne McCartney and Shabtai Bittman. They showed you can shift the stand from Kentucky bluegrass to more smooth brome. And that was by adding phosphorus with the nitrogen. However, what about potassium? Saskatchewan sells it. So they've got really good potassium in their soils. So and then the sulfur, even for, it's part of protein, it's a complex. So I make the grasses as healthy as they can, allow for that early growth of all of it to come. And unfortunately, the L-site clover lives a life cycle of about 5 years. And so once it does, if it's L-site, you're going to have it come in and live about that long and diminishing with that time as it feeds the grass nitrogen and the grass starts out managing it and manipulating it. But it's not going to be foolproof. But do a soil test and try to address some of those needs for the grasses. And the highest nitrogen rate is going to be the biggest benefit. But if you're short of sulfur or something else, you can't ignore it.
Well, I think that's it for questions.